All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 56th season of the Utah Shakespeare Festival. My name is Kate McPherson, and I am a professor of English and the honors program director about 3 hours up the road at Utah Valley University in Orem. I've been there for 17 years and thus been coming down here to this festival for about that number of times. I come just about every year. I've missed just a couple over the years, but it's my pleasure now to be on the staff here leading these seminars with my longtime colleague.
Hi, I'm Kate Moncrief. I'm a professor at Washington College in Chestertown, Maryland. I chair the English department there, and I'm a Shakespeare specialist. Kate and I, if you just shout Kate, one of us are going to answer you. Kate and I are longtime collaborators and partners. We've written 3 books together. The Kate and Kate Show is a long-running thing, and we are delighted to be here this summer. So we are joined by the director of Romeo and Juliet. We're going to have him available to answer questions. We're going to start with just a teeny bit of sort of facts and figures about Romeo and Juliet. This play, this story would have been really familiar to Shakespeare's audiences, as it probably is to us, right? Many of us have a long history with this play. We know this story. Shakespeare's audience would have known this story. It comes from Ovid, Pyramus, and Thisbe. We're going to see that version again if you're going to see the Midsummer Night's Dream, right? There's a nice pairing going on here. This play is written between 1591 and 1595. Midsummer Night's Dream is also 1595. And Shakespeare drew his sources from some prose romances in the 1560s that were published. So things from his childhood that he would have known really well. In terms of production, this play, along with Hamlet, is the most frequently produced of all of Shakespeare's plays. One of the little tidbits we gave about As You Like It, if you saw that, is that Rosalind has the most lines for any female character. Juliet is right up there as a major female character as well. So we're not going to give too much background on Romeo and Juliet because it is very familiar, but we're going to spend our time speaking with the director. He might be familiar to you. Would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Jim Sullivan.
You better.
Yeah, flip it up. There you go.
Hello.
Hello.
Yes, Jim Sullivan. I was formerly an associate artistic director here for many years. And I think I've done about 20 shows for the festival over the years. So,
Jim, could you start by talking about your relationship to Romeo and Juliet?
sure. Well, I write about this in the program. My first experience of the play was when I was 19 and saw Franco Zeffirelli's movie, uh, which made a big impact on me. And I think the primary impact was that completely got it. You know, I had had a spotty education in Shakespeare up to that time, and more a product of the fact that it didn't get much attention in the school beyond the usual plays. They didn't have it at Catholic school. They didn't have us read Romeo and Juliet, maybe because of this highly physical relationship between teenagers.
It is a sexy play. So
You know, the Scottish play was always bred, and all that retribution for evil doing. I mean,
We read Julius Caesar, right? No things you have to explain to teenagers about physicality.
but that was it. Just not being able to see it, not having that opportunity, and it was astonishing to me because it was so. I knew them. I just knew the situation, and I think that all productions of any plays of Shakespeare, the great ones, you know, always find their way of connecting immediately to whatever the zeitgeist is at the time. And certainly the generation gap in the 1960s was there, and so they fed right into that. But I was just astonished by how well I understood everything, and realized, of course, that this was an entirely new world to experience, and that was the beginning of it for me. And perhaps that's how it should be. You know, we stand astonished at seeing ourselves on stage, and in the medium of these plays, and thus deepen our investment in them.
Could you talk a little bit about this production, your concept and vision?
Well, it was related to Shakespeare in Love in that it would be much the same group of actors, and of course around the idea of that play be you know, this fancy of how it was created, you know, um, and um, and I knew, of course, Betsy McGavero. She and I worked together several times, and that was something I was very interested in having happen. And we talked about the Elizabethan stage being a character in the play itself, and that the design of the production would be very much of a Globe Theater view and quality. And the features of the Globe Theater are featured in the stage features on this set. So and so the chorus is our entree into the play, and if you all saw this last night, you saw that the chorus, in a Elizabethan costume, not in the clothes of Renaissance Italy, but rather of the time of the writing of the play. That is the frame device for the play that relates it to the time of Shakespeare in Love. And he relates to the space. If you remember, he comes in and touches the column, and then comes down and opens up the play to us with the chorus's words. The chorus's part is only two speeches in the play, as written, and one of which we cut. And it's usually Aeschylus that speaks the final words of the play. It's as written, but it's often assigned back to the chorus. And in this case, I wanted to keep the chorus throughout the play as a observer, as a hovering presence, and really, for me, he in his black clothing represents the other lover in this play, which is death.
Yeah, I noticed when he came in with the boys going to the mask,
Hmm.
he's wearing a death mask
Hmm.
and hovered at the back of the stage,
Yeah,
and that was my first clue that there was gonna be something really
yeah, we
special
don't
about
want to
this
make that
character.
too obvious. We just want to be there,
Yeah.
which is
It was
which,
really
which
nice.
is of course the truth about that fact of our
Yeah.
existence.
Mortality always looming
And
there.
that's Shakespeare's big subject in many ways: time, mortality. Yeah.
And death as a word is featured so many times in the play,
Mhm.
repeated over and over and over again. And so I thought that was a highly effective framing device. I really enjoyed it.
And that, I would say, that's the one thing we brought to this that I hadn't seen before. And I'm sure it's been done before, but I hadn't seen it. But I say that because I think it feels right. So somebody else must have thought of this too. But that's the first time I'd seen it and thought of it, and that was very important to this production.
Have you directed this play before?
Once many years ago. So this would be the second time.
And how did it feel coming to the play? A different stage in your life, different artistic phase of your life. How was it the second time around?
Well, I probably understand the parents better now.
Uh-huh.
I certainly did.
Well, we actually loved the parents in this production.
Yeah.
We thought there was some real heart and really genuine frustration. So often you see Capulet, you understand his violence and his anger, but the warmth. These were parents who were frustrated with that girl.
Yes.
He's done a father's duty. In the early modern period, there are all kinds of conduct books about the duty of children to parents, parents to children, servants to masters, and very explicitly, one of the father's duties is to match his daughter, to find a good match. And he's done it. He's done everything a good father's supposed to do. And she's not cooperating. The
Well,
frustration and the warmth were both there. And I thought that was highly effective rather
mhm.
than just playing the anger you so often see.
Right. This anger is usually the only thing
Yeah.
that happens, and there's no doubt that he has a temper. And really, he's so it's so clear to us that Juliet is so much the child of her parents
Yes.
because she exhibits both qualities
Right.
herself. If Lady Capulet is forever having to suggest caution. Wait a minute, we can't do it. We can't have it on Wednesday. We're not
You
prepared
are
for
too
this.
hot,
You're too
right? She
hot.
she
Yeah, and trying to
remonstrates with
manage
him when
him.
he loses his
Yeah.
temper.
Whereas he, can fly off the handle at a moment's notice. And what do we see at the? I keep putting over there. It's over here, isn't it? Used to the old theater over there. What do we see at the balcony scene? It's Juliet who says, "Now wait a minute, we should slow down here a little bit. I mean, this is too rash, too ill-advised, and all that." Goes in, talks to the nurse, comes right back out and says, "Are we getting married?"
Yeah, exactly. She
And
herself has a hair trigger, just
yeah,
like her
that's
dad.
right. So I think she's her parents. We all are products of
Yeah,
they who produced us.
I just thought that scene. I mean, so often I read that scene between Juliet and her father, or I see it, and I'm horrified by it, and I'm repulsed by his behavior towards her, but I actually felt very different about that scene last night because
As the parent of a teenage
as
daughter?
yeah, I mean, I have a daughter now who's 21 and she's wonderful and she's doing great things, but sometimes she just drives me crazy. You know, she just drives me crazy and I don't understand her decisions.
Yeah.
And I so felt sympathy for him because of that movement, that art from the genuine love and affection that he displayed for her to that, you just blow a gasket sometimes and then you say things you don't mean or you say things you regret, even if you meant them in the moment. And I think that's what happens in that scene. And it's so clear by the end of the play, his palpable grief for her as he kneels at her bedside and believes that she's dead.
Well,
It's
John Preston is a terrific actor, and he really brought that, to
yeah,
this. Yes, we did, want to create a more fully uh, complete person, and not just the role of anger. But he found such humanity and checking himself occasionally with his wife and all the rest. But that anger is important to the play. That
yeah.
passion.
It definitely is. I was thinking about the play and thinking about the relationship with Shakespeare in Love, and there's that bit where Will in Shakespeare in Love is giving advice to the young Thomas Kent as he's acting, and he says, "Don't spend it all at once. What are you going to do? When you love with your whole soul in 5 minutes from now." And I really thought that Preston was exhibiting that deep understanding of portraying a character and that movement from one space to another emotionally, which we likely have all felt ourselves, right? You're having a discussion with somebody, it takes a turn, it goes down a path that you're not expecting, and there's this long and looping arc to our relationships with the people we love.
Mhm.
I'd like to talk about Juliet a little bit. I thought Betsy was incredible and really special, right? And this is her play. It's called Romeo and Juliet, but this is her play, right? I often teach this play by talking about sonnets. So I start by talking about the prologue, Two Households, Both Alike in Dignity, is actually a sonnet. And I think you did something really interesting where you cut the last quatrain and the couplet of the opening sonnet, but by assigning the last six lines, which are also quatrain and a couplet, a broken sonnet, this is the nerdy literary person going, we've actually completed the sonnet by going back to the beginning. But sort of like knowing Ovid and knowing the Pyramus and Thisbe story, sonnets would have been really familiar to Shakespeare's audience. They reached their sort of vogue, height of their vogue in the 1590s. So any writer who was trying to make a name for himself was writing sonnets. Shakespeare was among them. And this play uses that sonnet format, uses the tropes of the sonnet in ways that are really fun. So one of those is that the sonnet was originally developed by Petrarch. Petrarch was in church and he looks across a crowded room and he sees Laura and he falls madly in love with her. Sound familiar? Right? So he falls in love with Laura and he writes something like 2,000 sonnets to Laura. Laura does not return his affections. In fact, Laura dies and he, pines for this girl. So we get the stereotype of the Petrarchan lover, the pining, pale, quivering, shaking. That's our Romeo that starts when he's in love with Rosalind. And then he quickly changes his affections to Juliet, as we know. But the other trope is that the lady doesn't return the affections in the sonnets and in the sonnet sequences. Shakespeare does something really interesting here with Juliet. She returns his affections. She desires. She's assertive. She wants him. She returns that. Could you talk a little bit about your choices with Juliet and things you think in the text and what Betsy did, how you guys
Hmm.
worked together to create this remarkable portrayal?
Well, well, as you say, and when they meet and speak, they create a
That's a
sonnet
sonnet.
together,
Yeah.
uh, and it is the language of the church. Love is a sacred thing. They talk about saints and holy Palmer's
Saints and
kiss,
hands do.
and he introduces a. It's all in sonnet form. It's circumscribed by form, much like the dance that they're doing is circumscribed. It's physical
Formal,
and formal. So
structured.
within the rules of that, they create this remarkable together in the moment,
Yep.
create this remarkable emotion. And I think that's the great achievement of that. Some of the most famous lines in all of Shakespeare, if I profane, etc. So I think it's important to see, and it's difficult. This is a long play, and which was fine for the Elizabethan audiences. I think if you went to all the trouble to get to the South Bank to see a play, back then you wanted to be there for 4 hours at least, but nowadays, if people aren't out by 11, they get itchy. So we you have to make
Early modern
cuts. Yeah,
audiences were trained to listen. They would go to hear
yeah.
sermons for 3 and 4 hours. They
They
would
would
go to hear a play.
hear a play, not we say see.
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
yeah, that's right. So choices had to be made, but it was important to me to keep as much of the sonneteer training, so to speak, about Romeo, with his with Rosaline passion. Again, a woman he can only love from afar, and one who's not returning his love. One who apparently is at that ball, by the way, although we only have two. It's a guessing game which one might be Rosaline. I don't know. Two ladies
Some
up there dancing.
pretty girls at the ball.
But that doesn't matter. Once he sees Juliet, of course, he only has eyes for her. So, but it's interesting. I think the sonnets about Rosaline are fine. They're not bad. They're okay.
Standard issue
Yeah,
sonnets,
yeah. You
right?
can see the rhymes coming. Even he mocks some of the sonnets as he says them. He mocks himself in a self-deprecating way.
And the other boys mock him for his
Yeah.
Petrarchan attitudes.
Yeah, yeah, and well, that's well, especially through Mercutio, which is an entire, it's a whole other topic.
We should get to that in a little
Yeah,
while.
but I think it's what happens in the sonnet form when he meets Juliet, and they create their passionate, heart pounding poetry together. That takes it to an entirely new place, and he's no longer a sonneteer in training.
As they share quatrain, 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 and then they share the lines. They start a second sonnet, and Shakespeare even does something surprising there. He kisses her, and remember Juliet's response to that? You kiss by the book, right? She's cheeky. I got something to say about you.
The other thing I think that draws on this wonderful sonnet tradition is that for I've so often noticed in the play this language of paradox, right? Of love and death. And Juliet, I can't remember it. Kate will know it better than me because she's played Juliet. Um, when she was young. She she goes on that long speech about the burning fire and the what is that? Do you know it enough to?
Which one are you thinking about? The come night, come black brown night.
After the nurse.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
He has one which actually a lot of it's cut from this play, but there's these speeches of paradox and opposites paired, wolf ravening lamb, things like that. Yeah, so which is interesting because they each do it separately and of one another, so their mind works the same way. As well.
So that and this was one of the things in sonnets, this tradition of these union of honest, that you have burning ice and freezing fire, and this is one of the things then Shakespeare turns around and he mocks in that very famous sonnet 130, my mistress eyes are nothing like the sun, and he turns that all on its head in that poem, and he kind of does that in places in Romeo and Juliet. He turns the whole Petrarchan thing on its head in some ways by making Juliet this very active woman who has agency about what she wants to do with her life. I mean, yeah, she's swept up in a tidal, wave of teenage love and passion, but she chooses things to do. She's the one that says to Romeo, "Let's get married." He doesn't propose, she does.
Well, Jim,
That's some interesting agency.
Jim, you used the word form, and I think that's one of the pleasures of form. Sonnet form is highly structured, and to be able to exhibit your skill by working in the form, then when you master it, like a jazz musician who begins to improvise, Shakespeare does that. He works in the form, he demonstrates he can work in the form, and then he riffs. He does things with the form and plays with the form. So 1595, this is quite an early play still, but we're really beginning to see Shakespeare, the genius. We see what is to come. We see the heroines that we're going to get later on. So he masters form and then he plays and he moves beyond it.
Why don't we talk about Mercutio a little bit? You brought him up, and he's such a wonderfully vibrant portrayal in last night's show. That was, super great. I just was so excited by it. So
Well, he's losing his friend, and he's mad about it. I mean, I think it does represent. He does represent. I mean, to him, women are a problem. They're dangerous. He objectifies them. He represents there's a lot of misogyny in this. He represents this a homoerotic ideal, and I don't mean the sense of homosexuality, uh,
Just the relationship
but
between men as the
but
primary
is the
thing in a man's
primary thing.
life.
That's right.
Mhm,
Well,
mhm.
a homosocial community
Yeah,
among men, a community
Right.
among Shakespeare does that a lot. What
yeah,
happens when the community of men is disrupted by love, by
right,
women?
right. And he too. So we would recognize that the kind of behavior exhibited by them and Mercutio to Romeo, especially in certain sports clubs now or fraternities or it's a sort of a force of opinion. Yeah, and if you want to be included in this, this is how you would feel, and a force of opinion. But there's genuine affection between these two friends.
Yeah, they
And
love each other
yeah, yes,
as
yeah,
men
yeah,
who are deep friends can do.
yeah. And I think Mercutio's fighting for him, fighting to get him back. And that's what we wanted to explore, certainly. Yeah. But his Queen Mab speech is
Yes.
it
Let's talk
begins
about
as
that.
a very famous speech, of course, in all of Shakespeare, and one of the best known. And I said to Jeb Burris, there's something the manic depressive qualities in Mercutio, which we would recognize as that surely existed then, but didn't have a name,
Right. It
and
might be called melancholy or it
yeah,
might be
one of
called,
the
something
humors,
else.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
An excess of,
But
choler.
I think it's in three parts, that speech. He begins with a kind of he's the leader of the gang. He's Riff in West Side Story parlance, and he it's on him to be the primary energy and entertainment and motivator of the group. And he starts the Mab speech as a kind of Obi-Wan Kenobi sort of. Let me tell you the what is in the Force out there. But it moves into he begins to improvise on it, and then in the involutions of it, he gets all wrapped up in something
In
that's
the darker
yeah,
aspects of this magic that he's exploring in the
yeah, which I
speech.
thought is a nightmare, for
Yes.
him. He gets caught up in his own nightmare. And I said, it's not, if you see old tapes of Robin Williams doing his improv acts in California, where he would just go on and on and on with this dense, complex, witty, quick,
Sub-referenced. Yeah.
uh, riff on things. He was our Robin Williams here,
Ah,
and and
uh-huh.
and and getting wrapped up in that, which takes him to a dark place, which Romeo is the only one who really rescue him from. And I
And
think,
has to literally sort of wrestle
yeah,
him back from it. He
I think that's
physically
I think that's the
embraces him
source of
and has to
Mercutio's need
shake
for
him.
Romeo. I think he knows that Romeo is the only one who can give him the lifeline, and he's losing him.
You talk of nothing, he says, right? And Mercutio's like, oh, yeah, yeah, okay, 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 wait, wait. I got to reel myself back in from this brink of imagination that I teeter on, clearly all too frequently. They're all like, nobody, and his friends are not shocked by his behavior, I don't think. So
They
they
count
must
on
have
it.
seen it before. They must have seen it before. And I'm awfully glad we get to see it with Jeb's portrayal last night. That was really exciting, I thought.
But he's with his endless series of phallic jokes and this and that. I mean, he certainly objectifies women and only sees them as sexual objects. So
Yeah, and we don't see
big
him
difference
having
between him and Romeo.
he doesn't have any meaningful relationships with women in the way that we see other men in the play having meaningful relationships with women. I mean, Romeo's initial relationship with Rosaline is not particularly meaningful. It's quite stereotypical, but then he moves into something else where he begins to see that that depth is possible. You certainly see it between the Capulets also. Um,
Yeah, well, Romeo, I think, and as far as Mercutio goes, by the way, I'm not sure he really does feel that way. He's a mystery. I think that's the party place in this particular culture and world. But who knows how he really feels? I think there's much more there. Obviously, Romeo, though, I mean, at the beginning, we have a phrase now. He's really in love with love at the beginning.
My students often say Romeo is emo guy.
that emo
That
guy.
emo guy,
He feels all
emotional,
his
over
feelings all
emotional.
the time.
Yeah, all his feelings, feeling all the feelings. Yeah. So we would love to turn this to the audience. If you have some questions for our director, for us, some observations about the
Hand me a
play,
mic.
is there anyone who would like to comment?
Let me bring you a microphone. Who has a question for the director or over here, over here?
One thing I thought was really interesting about this production was so in the Shakespeare in Love, I felt like one of the main themes was what Elizabeth talks about of, you know, can you really show true love on the stage? And the idea that this is done in Romeo and Juliet, at least I think that was implied. And to me, when I've seen Romeo and Juliet before, it's been, it's just passion. It's just a teenage fling. They're not really, it's
Infatuation.
just infatuation. And that's how I've seen it portrayed. And I felt like this made me believe that actually falling in love at first sight is possible. And in that era where, you couldn't just, she couldn't just go out on the street and go, I mean, dating, it wasn't a thing. It wasn't a thing. And so I can't help wondering if it made me believe that in a time period where you couldn't go out and socialize really freely with the other gender, that maybe people developed the ability to actually fall in love. And the way it was portrayed, I thought, wow, they fell in love. This wasn't just some teenage fling.
The early moderns actually believed that looking was powerful, that if we were looking at each other, that eye beams would come back and forth and go down into the heart and have a physical effect. So they had a more deeply rooted belief in that. But I think you're right. Our skepticism of like love at first sight, really? Yeah.
Especially for a 14 and 15-year-old child. They are children, but they behave in these very adult ways that is perplexing. Now, it is, I believe, true that the Shakespeare changes Juliet's age from the source materials and makes her quite a bit younger.
Yep.
And so there's all this discourse in the play about women as old as you are happily made mothers, and so her family's trying to normalize the fact that she's marrying. But in fact, in Shakespeare's England, the average age of marriage for women was 24, older than it is in Utah, by the way.
20.
Although it was younger for aristocratic women. For women of Juliet's rank, they would have perhaps been betrothed as children, and they might have been officially married.
For men, it was 27 or 28 because often they finished a 7-year apprenticeship first. So the age of marriage is actually older.
Yeah. I mean, and people got married, but that doesn't mean they necessarily consummated their marriage, right? I mean, it was, certainly traditional, obviously, for people, for families to wait until the children were moving through puberty to, make them live side by side. They might be legally married or something, but Juliet's very ready to consummate that marriage relationship. She's quite happy about that. She looks forward to it. And she's not shy about expressing that. And that's an interesting thing, and it's not something that we see all that often on the Shakespearean stage, is a woman of her age being quite that direct about the enjoyment of a physical relationship. And she's really happy about that, and so
Jim,
I'm
do you
happy
want
for
to
her.
comment about the love at first sight and how you thought about that?
Well, we take this for granted now because we live in a culture where we live in a culture where we believe in the possibility of that. We certainly are bombarded by film and television that features that. It's the norm to us, but it wasn't then. I mean, this idea of individuals finding their other
Right.
happened sometime between the Middle Ages and now, and might have even been coming to the fore about then. But that wasn't the
Marriage was a familial contract.
yeah.
And we're moving from that to love matches. This is a period in transition.
Right. And so what the Capulets are doing for their daughter was more the norm.
Mhm.
And really, quite frankly, they've arranged a great match for her.
Yeah,
You know,
lottery winning match.
Paris is related to Prince Aeschylus.
He's a count.
There's money involved.
Status.
It's a step up. Our view of the Capulets was that they were a merchant family,
Mhm.
and uh, more or less lately rich,
Nouveau
lately
riche.
ascending, in
Mhm.
the economic and social structure of Verona. That maybe that was part of the enmity between the Montagues and them.
Ah,
Montagues being old money, old family, been here many, many, many uh, generations, that sort of thing. And at the Capulets too. I mean, we don't get much of the Montagues in the play, but the
no.
Capulets are a little showy, material. Wealth is important to them.
Party throwing,
Yeah,
inviting all the guests in the town.
yeah,
That feast with the peacock back there, that's pretty extravagant.
overloaded.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely the groaning table there. That was really interesting.
But the idea of making our own matches, I mean, this is something that developed in Western culture, and most of the world isn't that way.
Yeah, even now, right? It's perfectly normal for your family to say, here are some acceptable candidates for you
And
too.
also markets and capitalist culture.
Mhm. Yeah, that's great. All right. Who else has a question or a comment, an idea, something they want to clarify? And I'll come to
Uh,
you next.
I was thinking back for just a minute to the relationship between Mercutio and Romeo. Uh, I have a feeling those are the precursors of the characters of Goose and Maverick in Top Gun. I mean, there was Goose, who was the faithful companion and able to keep Maverick grounded, and there was Maverick just daring and ready to take off and chase the skirts. And I mean, it was just,
It's archetypal, isn't it?
yeah,
These two. Yes, that's right.
Gotta have a wingman.
Yeah.
yeah. And Romeo had been Mercutio's wingman, and here he was thinking about getting married and taking off and being
Leaving the
all
gang.
lovesick, and
Yeah.
he was blowing his role there.
Yeah. There's more than one kind of separation that comes with the movement into adulthood, right? You move away from your parents and into a marital relationship. But that marital relationship, anybody that's ever gotten married knows that your friends you had when you were single, you have to reform a different relationship with them if they're still single and you're married. That's a very different thing.
Yeah, those wedding bells were truly breaking up that old gang.
That's right. That's right. There's more that let me get this question, then I'll come here.
So one of the lines that I thought was really interesting, and I've read this play a couple of times, and it's never stood out to me as much as it did last night, was when Romeo's purchasing the poison from the apothecary, and he makes that comment about wealth and about how he sold the poison to
I
the
love that
apothecary.
speech.
Yeah, I do too. And what's really fascinating to me is Romeo comes from money, clearly, and the play really captures um, the characters are all of wealth, or at least the main characters. And so my curiosity lies in where would Romeo have found the sophistication to make a comment like that if his whole life had just been living in wealth, or what were Shakespeare's attitudes
I think
towards
there are
wealth?
hints of it. There's some distance between he and his parents. They never exchange a word in the play. At the very beginning, he's coming up the walk. He sees them. He holds back. He waits till they're gone. There's clearly a division there. There are problems there. I had talked to my view to both Mercutio and Romeo was that these were guys who were, in a late 40s, 1950s sense, were beats, who came from money up on the Upper East Side, but were spending all their time down in the village. They were into poetry, they were into music, they were into girls, they were into acting out that, and that there was a rejection, and you feel it in Mercutio's attitude about Tybalt, who he keeps characterizing as one of these fine tuners of this. It's not just his fighting; it's his whole manner and behavior that from our point of view, he was rejecting. He was being a little counterculture about it and rejecting that old way. And I think that Romeo's sudden, in the midst of his shock, and what goes on in our minds when we hear something like that, when we're just shocked into this numbness with the news, such as Balthazar brings to Romeo. and what goes on with the mind, and how what compartmentalizing goes on, just so you can make the next step to get to the next hour, to get to the next evening, to get to the next place I have to be. I mean, he has to be doing something like that. And I think what happens in the course of that speech is an insight that's suddenly clear to him, that's born of thinking that he and his friends have done about old Verona, and how it doesn't need to be that way. One of the heartbreaks of this play is that the young feel that they will really fix a broken world. Uh, that the young should feel that they're inheriting something that's broken in some fashion, and that we will fix it, by our values, by our core beliefs, by our loves, by our passions. We will fix this. And one of the things they want to fix is something that's gone wrong about money and behavior in Verona. So his sudden insight about a worse poison than you give me, worse for men's souls, which, root of all evil, we have a phrase for, and an idea that's played out in many of Shakespeare's plays about the corrupting influence of that, the poison of that, the control it has on us, is remarkable at that moment in the play. It's often cut, because people want, it's the clock is moving, and we want to
Got to shorten that long
get to
play.
the tomb. But it's remarkable, isn't it? And I just was determined not to lose that. So I'm glad it landed with you.
That's great. I'm really glad you're able to do that.
How wealth may have been the division between the Montagues and the Capulets in this capitalist
Yeah,
competition.
we wanted to
So
imply that, yeah.
that context, in addition to the remark that Romeo made, perhaps was an insightful commentary about how wealth brought them to the situation that they're in.
Well, here's the other remarkable thing about Shakespeare, to me, and I'm not the first person to say this, but it's not just the minutiae of the human heart, but the complete world that you get again and again, within which the story operates. That's why the completeness of the Capulet characters is so important to us. So it's not just the function of rejection and anger, motivating and being that part of the tragedy, but there's an entire world going on here.
Okay, have one here in the center.
Uh, Given that this is audience preview, I assume that the audience will have some kind of uh, forum to express how the play we see. We all know what we love Shakespeare, and we've looked at him from many angles. But I think the issue here is this play and how we, the audience, reacted to it. And I find there are things I would like to tweak.
Me too.
Okay, and I assume that that's why we have an audience.
Yeah, the preview process is
Preview.
about finding
Right.
the play. It's
Right.
still in rehearsal, as they
Right.
say.
Okay, and I understand your choice. You wanted to keep it very simple, open stage, uh, Globe Theater type thing, which prevented a lot of dramatic lighting and all that they didn't have back in Shakespeare's time. So I believe I'm not a great scholar of Shakespeare, but or theater for that matter. I'm just a guy who likes to watch it. That the open stage did not work with not no dramatic lighting and no and also not having disappearing the actors from the previous scene. So you don't get the transition. You see two or three actors who were very prominent in the previous scene, and they're still sitting there, and the protagonist is moving over to a wall and starts talking, and what's happening? So I find that disruptive.
Which scene are you referring to?
Uh, Gosh, I don't remember. There were only a couple of scenes like that where I'm sitting and I say, "Oh yes, this is open stage." I was just thrown off. I didn't get the smooth transition from one scene to the other. Uh,
If I could make a quick comment on this particular theater and the way this would have originally been staged. So when this would have been on stage in 1595, it would have premiered at the Curtain and at the theater. So there again is our correspondence to Shakespeare in Love. Shakespeare would not have had any lighting in this open stage. The plays were at about 2 or 3 in the afternoon, and the stage would have been bare. They spent all their money on costumes. So when we look at Henslow's diaries, we can see big expenditures for costumes. There's a funny little note about a play by Thomas Haywood called A Woman Killed with Kindness. They spent more on one dress for the character Anne to wear than they paid the playwright for the play. So there would have been no lighting, and there would have been a very bare stage, minimal props, a little bit of, we might bring a throne on, we might bring a table on. In some ways, this
A
is quite
weapon here and
faithful
there.
to Shakespeare's original staging conditions. So, just worth sort of noting that.
Yeah, but
Jim, your
it's a
thoughts?
good point. I mean, because though the plays were written for bare platforms, and then they would tour them too. I think there are a number of what they call corrupted quartos of the play floating around too, and they might have been versions for touring the play as well. And that certainly would have been on a platform or even a courtyard, that they would have played in, so that the dramatic structure of the plays were written with that in mind, so that characters are forever walking on, saying where they are, or where they're going. There's language specifically about that. The Friar Lawrence leaves after he finds out that the letter wasn't delivered. The last thing he'll say is, "Oh, poor Juliet, to wake up in a dead man's tomb," and then those words would be this. All right, that's where we're going. That's the set. You wouldn't see it, but he would give it to you in the language, and so that's the dramatic structure of the play. But here we are now in the 21st century. Um, uh, uh, Creating entertainments, engaging audience eyes who are coming to see a play and are used to and seeing more often in terms of spectacle, but certainly in terms of scenic support, everything that you will see, for instance, in Randall
Yeah.
shows.
Are you checking out that Midsummer Night's Dream that's playing? It's open premieres
Next week, Bean's previewing
next week.
on
Tuesday.
Tuesday. Yeah.
Tuesday. So there's in the indoor theater a very richly visual, concept driven
Yeah.
Midsummer Night's Dream that is going to have a lot of that what you
So
think of as
here at
gorgeous
this
stage effects.
festival, especially with the two theaters, there is an ideal about recalling Shakespeare's world with the plays that are on the outdoor theater. But as Kate to my right has said, they were performed in the afternoon. Of course, there was no electricity, which is why you have endless light cues written into the language of Shakespeare. What light from yonder window breaks? He says there's no light because it's in the afternoon. Anyway, and we have no light because it's still evening light, and the sun is shooting through the timbers over here. Yes,
And of course
there were
the
fireworks,
community
yes.
celebrating
Fireworks and motorcycles last night at key moments. Lovely. So
If you go to the Globe in London, you're competing with Heathrow. You get the
there's
planes
the
flying
flight pattern is
overhead.
overhead. Oh yes, way.
so I would say I recognize what you're saying. It's very true. And one of the problems for a director is, all right, how will these scenes overlap so that the storytelling has propulsion and momentum, and that area of what the audience accepts as the reality of this. So like characters leaving, characters coming in, there is often an overlap. And I think there are a couple of those that are a little rough right now in Romeo and Juliet, which is why I asked the specific scene. There are a few of those that I'm not happy with, and I get about 8 hours of rehearsal before the official opening. I'll be tinkering with that.
With some of the transitions.
Yeah, because you want it to be poetic. You want it to have, as they say, a visual. You tell a story visually as well as orally. With the language, and finding that cohesion between the two is the key. So we're a little bit in the world of how it would have been with Shakespeare, but also enough in our world to make it appealing that way. So I think we're still finding that. It's a very good observation.
So maybe choice.
Since we're live streaming this.
I understand your choosing the idea that you will try to recreate this play in that time, what the way the audience might have reacted, but we are not in that time. We're not, and we have a lifetime of seeing of movies of right now fast cutting and all that. We receive our drama in a different, much different way than they ever did. So maybe you could uh, you should reconsider the idea that you want to put us back as an audience at a time when we don't have know how to be that kind of audience.
Right.
That-
It's a good thing, and it's a real challenge for directors now, I think, to
Yes, it
battle
is.
the audience's training as consumers of film primarily as their visual entertainment.
Yeah,
Well,
one
that
more
was a
thought.
good follow-up because I felt the same. I mean, I understand what you're saying, but what I'm thinking is that it is such a mental exercise for us to be able, as a movie-going, instant gratification population now, to be able to step back and use our brains in a different way. That is so important. And the things that we're developing as audience and observers of, for instance, Shakespeare, you think in a different way. I mean, you really have to pay attention to what they're saying. And obviously, you don't catch everything. But when you do catch the little snippets, it's like, oh man, that was a really good joke. You know,
That was
I
a
found
zinger.
I found myself laughing last night, and other people around me were just kind of sitting there. But it does exercise, it connects those little neurons in your brain that we are not accustomed to doing. So actually, people who stretch themselves enough to watch Shakespeare or listen to Shakespeare to read it is, I mean, obviously for you guys, it's something that is probably part of second nature for you.
It is
But
now.
yeah, for sure. But for someone who isn't exposed as that much to it, to watch it and to observe it and to put all those scenes together and to connect the intricacies that are in there, it's wonderful. It's
Well, you
really
mentioned reading.
invigorating.
These plays were written to be performed. Sometimes when I sit in an English classroom and I teach Shakespeare through performance. No one will be surprised to hear that. But the idea of sitting to read these plays were made to be performed. They were made to be consumed in that particular way. Nobody went out later and said, I got to pick up the script to that one. They weren't highly available. There were some quartos, but it was meant to be heard and consumed in that particular way. They weren't sitting there analyzing every line on the page at all.
The other interesting thing maybe that connects with these comments is that in um as they explore in Shakespeare in Love, a play in the early modern period, in the Elizabethan era, wasn't high literature. I mean, it was poetry, but this was popular entertainment. And, I often explain to my students that Shakespeare was sort of equal parts, Pulitzer Prize winner and George Lucas, right? He was an entertainer. He wanted to put on plays that people wanted to come see, even as he was creating this beautiful poetry to do it through. And so, these were the common people in many cases. I mean, the plays were performed at court, but more people who were just citizens of London came to the theater. And
Well,
Kate had a great
yeah,
tidbit
a
the other
fact
day.
I
What's
shared
that factoid?
Yeah, so early modern London had a population of about 200,000 at this time period. And on any given day, 10,000 people were going to the theater. We think of our, sort of complete works of Shakespeare. We've got this big, heavy tome. That first folio wasn't printed until 1623. Shakespeare died in 1616. And to put them in that very rich folio format was shocking. Shakespeare's contemporary playwright Ben Jonson published his own works in a folio, and the works of Ben Jonson, and people sort of scoffed at him. These are plays. These aren't literature. These aren't works, right? So very much mass culture, popular culture.
What is your question, ma'am?
I'd like for you to talk a little about the balcony scene. I saw both the plays and was comparing the relationship that Violet had with Will, and then the next night she becomes a teenager. And in the balcony scene, especially the beginning part where she was alone, I really could see her as a teenager. And I thought, this is really acting. She's getting across to me that she is young and impulsive and so emotional that she's not really in charge. And the comparison between the two was just very impressive to me.
You know, one of the things that the theater gives us is an audience is the opportunity to be involved in an experience that they're viewing individually and communally. And there is an energy to that involvement that creates what we call the theater. Theater that works is not something that's done to us. It's something that we are involved with. And the very architecture of Shakespeare's theater would have supported that. They were standing around, a platform. There was an angle dimensionality to that. It wasn't a proscenium sort of rectangular or even TV screen, kind of experience where you sat back and it was done to you and you consumed it, but rather it was something that you leaned into and were involved with, that you affected. That was an ideal that they perfected. They knew it by touring. They knew it by surviving. It's in the structure of the plays. Even in a tragedy like Macbeth, a clown will come out to deal with the audience. This play has a touch of that in Peter, the servant, the assistant, really, to the nurse, and the nurse herself. Again, the full experience, the full life experience, where it's tragic and comic all at once. This play is structured as a comedy in its first act, and our first act, and a tragedy in the second. It's structured and functions as a comedy until all of a sudden Mercutio has been killed, and that's the pivot point.
Turns on a
Play.
dime.
Yeah. But that's why I use the aisles a lot at the beginning of the play, which is that kind of right into the audience involvement with it, and then it begins to recede a little bit as the evening darkens here, and the world of Romeo and Juliet becomes much more circumscribed and smaller and smaller and smaller until they're just those two bodies on that tomb already underground. In that we enter the tomb from above, going down, so that the visual aspect and story of that is told. Yeah, as written, the scene is outside and inside in the play, and that he breaks into the Capulet family crypt, and then they go down, which we altered a little bit just for the sake of that stage and the space. But the balcony scene, probably the most famous scene in all of Shakespeare, one that's been parodied endlessly. I think probably my first experience with the balcony scene was a Bullwinkle and Rocky and Bullwinkle version when I was 8 years old. And
Romeo and Juliet is the most
Romeo,
adapted.
yes, that's right. I mean, you hear the lines and you know them right away because you heard them when you were a kid, and other versions. So to take it to the place of this play, and the beauty of that language, but also the presence of us with it, so that we are there in that orchard, in that secret place of theirs. We are there at that time of this ripening of love at first sight, this falling into the kind of love we all want to fall into, that all in kind of love. Involves a simplicity of approach that we did not want to ornament it in any way. We didn't want to enhance it. We wanted to simply be as simple as we could, with the language, so that we could get to the truth of them being absolutely enthralled with the presence of the other. That I've said to them over and over is that you just can't take your eyes off each other. You wouldn't. And thus, that's the window for our audience to do the same and to have their emotions, no matter what our age is.
Okay, we have just a few minutes left. Maybe time for a couple of more questions.
I'm curious, how many of you saw both Shakespeare in Love and Romeo and Juliet?
Ah, good, good, good. This is what the festival experience can do for you. These shows and repertory, to see the same or a very overlapping set of actors doing different plays, and especially these two plays, which, Shakespeare in Love, as Brian Vaughan put it in his program night, right, is a Valentine to Shakespeare and to Romeo and Juliet. And then to be able to see Romeo and Juliet, if you saw Brian's talk yesterday, you'll note that he really stressed that of all of the places in North America that are doing Shakespeare in Love right now, the Utah Shakespeare Festival is the only one that's pairing up these two plays, which I don't know how the other people missed that opportunity, but I'm glad that we have it here.
And to see that same actress, as you were just commenting, to see Betsy playing both Viola de Lesseps, to see that source story, and then to see her actually the fully realized Juliet the next night. Gives me chills to think
I
about
have a
it.
question. Then this is like a survey, audience survey moment. Do you think it was better to see Shakespeare in Love and then Romeo and Juliet, or would you rather have seen it the other direction?
No, I liked it.
You like it this way? This way? Do you have this sequence? I did, but I was curious what some other people thought.
Quick comment.
Well, I think Shakespeare in Love, Romeo and Juliet, and then Shakespeare in Love again. That would be ideal.
There you go. We recommend that one too.
And Shakespeare in Love is this. I mean, we
Festival
were
would love that.
yeah, we were talking about how Shakespeare in Love, right? It's got all these layered lines and all these references to all these other plays. It really is the kind of play that you really need to see more than once.
And the great
get it.
fun to add midsummer next week is going to be that you're going to get the Pyramus and Thisbe story again in the play within the play. I think
Right.
this season is so beautifully chosen the way the plays speak to each other.
Right. Okay. One more question here.
Oh well, as while we were talking about the balcony scene and the relationship of the two plays, I just have to say I was just awestruck with Betsy, the actress that played Juliet and also played Viola. The just you could tell the difference. Last night, Viola, she was definitely a little older, a little more mature in her thinking, and slightly progressive for a woman of her time, slightly ahead of her time. And the very same actress showed up, and I could believe Viola was a little older. I'm guessing like maybe in her 20s, early 20s,
I think so.
maybe. But last night she was a teenager, and before she opened her mouth, I could see her as a teenager. It was the body language and the posture and the attitude that she went, and the tone of voice that she used, that she just transformed herself from a young woman in her 20s to a girl of possibly 14 or sweet 16. I mean, that was just
she's
an
just on the
amazing,
eve of turning 14.
amazing.
Can you pass the mic right there?
And while you're talking about the connections between the plays, I had my grandchildren here with me, and nobody's talking about the connection between this play and As You Like It, which are the two plays that they saw. And oh my goodness, they picked up on that Rosaline right away. They
Our
knew
kids.
that they're like, that was in the other play, and they're just going into second grade and into fourth grade. So they're fairly young. They're kind of the youngest grandkids we've brought for a long time, but they picked up on that right away. They also picked up on chorus. They wanted to know what he was doing. He just stands there. What's he doing? So they were really
Waiting, yes.
Yeah, they were.
Waiting.
Think about
They were really.
midsummer as well. We get two plays that go into the woods, right?
Yeah.
We leave civilization, we leave court, we go into the woods. Different things happen in those woods. In
There's-
midsummer, they become a little bit of a nightmare, but there's
then-
correspondence there.
The thing that got me too was the repertory quality of the actors. Is the fact that you have Orlando talking about Rosaline, and they caught on that it was the same. They noticed
name.
it was this same guy.
There's even
wasn't it?
another little subtle connection, and the whoever
Same-
whoever loved not at first sight is a line that's more or less said in Midsummer, as well as Romeo and Juliet, and in As You Like It, and it's pretty much a paraphrase or quote from a Christopher Marlowe line earlier, in Marlowe appearing in Shakespeare in Love.
That's wonderful. And the other connection that, as we preview next week's previews of Midsummer Night's Dream, Romeo and Juliet, as we see and as you note, is set up as a comedy. at the beginning of the play, right? It's happy, people are falling in love, there's weddings being arranged, it's all is looking very rosy until that moment when it turns and the duel and somebody dies. A Midsummer Night's Dream is just the inverse of that. This is a play that starts out with lovers being divided, threats of death onto a young woman, or being sent to a nunnery if she doesn't do what her father says. And then it flips and it turns into a comedy. And so Romeo and Juliet and A Midsummer Night's Dream are sort of mirror opposites of one another. You're going to see very different productions of them.
I really believe he wrote them about the same time.
Yeah,
did,
it's
yeah.
same year.
1595.
Scholars agree.
It's just the the sonnet form too, and the language, use of language, and
Midsummer is
all the way through.
incredibly playful with form. He's a jazz musician in Midsummer. You get triplets and couplets and quatrains, and he's like really displaying his acumen with like, I know all these poetic forms. I'm going to show them off, and then I'm going to go somewhere else. Yeah.
Well, we are out of time for this morning's discussion. We thank you for joining us. After the beginning next week, we will have the 9 a.m. discussions of the plays in the Ingolstadt Theater. And then at 10 a.m. at this hour, we'll transition and discuss the shows in the Randall. And so if you are here, tomorrow is an off day for seminars because there are no shows tonight. But starting Tuesday morning, I believe we start in with 2 seminars on Tuesday. Is that right,
That's right.
Bailey?
That's
Yeah, so if you're still around, we hope we'll see you then. We thank you for your excellent questions and your participation. And please give our director, Jim Sullivan, a hand for joining us this morning.
Thanks very much.